out. Everybody.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Lights Out. I'm Josh.
I'm Ian.
And I'm Daniel.
And today we're back with this one is a heavy one.
Yeah.
Extremely heavy. And maybe you've heard of Dr. Death before. I think most of us have if you're sort of in this space of, I don't even know, the world.
The dark.
Of the morbid and dark and macabre. You've probably heard of Dr. Death, Jack Kevorkian.
Right.
But have you heard of Reverend Death? And this, Ian had found this guy and had mentioned it to me a while back, and I was just kind of going through looking again. I was like, who is this guy? I gotta know more about him. And there's a lot.
There's a lot.
On
There's a lot. If you also watch Mile Higher podcast, it came to me, I'm pretty sure, when I was researching the Dannion Brinkley, the near-death experience, and Mr. George Exos loved the hell out of these NDEs because to him, they kind of proved an afterlife. And in terms of George's whole worldview, his whole makeup of why he did what he did, that proof of the afterlife was kind of essential.
Yeah, and I think there's a bit of a flaw to that sort of thinking, though, because he's basing his entire sort of practice and ministry, as he calls it, on these NDEs, which are people who nearly died,
right,
but didn't actually die,
right,
permanently. And this idea of the afterlife is this, and it's this grand adventure, it's this wholly positive experience. And I think there's definitely some flaws in that thinking, because none of us know.
We don't know.
No one's ever died and then truly come back, beyond just people who've been medically declared dead and then they're resuscitated and brought back, and they have these near-death experiences, but we don't even fully understand the source of these near-death experiences. Or are they actually seeing what death is like, or are they seeing something that's manufactured by the brain during that process?
Right.
And so George had kind of taken this philosophy of these NDEs prove exactly what's to come when anybody dies. And he became sort of this self-proclaimed midwife to dying. And the thing about George, if you've never heard of him, is he specialized in assisted deaths and assisting others in taking their own life. And things get very, very cloudy.
Yes.
This is a really hard one to kind of go about talking about, because we're obviously talking about a very sensitive subject here. And George, on the outside, especially when you kind of see him at first, you think, here's a guy who's wanting to provide comfort, relief to those who have had enough.
Right.
And, there's obviously a major proponent for the right to die movement. And the interesting thing, though, is George's, I guess, quote unquote, clients or patients were not terminally ill, like a lot of other right to die groups or sort of, physician assisted deaths kind of take a different approach to it. And so George kind of was there when all these other groups would turn them away because they didn't sort of, I guess, qualify under their criteria. And George would always be the one.
Always honor it. And then always be almost enthusiastic about it.
He's a very interesting person.
Yes.
And it's really hard to, and as we kind of go through his story and his life, it's really hard to determine what was his true intentions behind doing what he did. Was it truly out of this, I want to help people, I want to be there for them, they're going to do this anyway, so I want to be there to sort of make this a seamless transition? Or was there something sort of darker to him, some other intentions that maybe pushed him in this direction?
Yeah. This episode discusses the topic of unaliving. Listener discretion is advised.
which obviously with a topic like this, it's very difficult to put this out on YouTube.
Yes.
So we have heavily sort of censored the episode so that we reduce using the word, as you know. But let's go ahead and get into things here. So in 1995, a man with ALS asked Reverend George Exos to assist in his self-inflicted death, which the Reverend warmly agreed to. And as he heard the man's last breath rattle out, he had something of an epiphany. George finally found his purpose in life: to help people die. And while most right-to-die groups require someone to be terminally ill to guide them, George broadened the criteria for himself. As long as they claim to experience immense suffering, no matter the diagnosis, he agreed to facilitate their passing. And this eventually landed him in a West Virginia jail after helping a woman kill herself in Ireland, which is a criminal offense. And over the course of 2 decades, George developed a reputation for being a prolific organizer of illegal assisted deaths. And he quickly became one of the most despised figures in the movement as the number of clients continued to rise. So how did George end up here? Let's go back to the beginning of George's life so we can try to truly understand how he ended up where he did. But George Exos was born on August 22nd, 1942 in Cleveland, Ohio. And although he was raised a Methodist, his approach to seeking the divine greatly strayed from his parents' teaching. In fact, it was different from most people's journey to enlightenment. As an adult, George attended UC Berkeley, Emerson College, and Harvard Divinity School, studying English, music, social sciences, theology, and religion. He then taught sociology at several colleges before becoming an ordained Unitarian Universalist Reverend in 1973. And the Universalist Church is definitely different than a lot of other sort of Christian churches out there. According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Unitarianism is a liberal, open-minded religious tradition that emphasizes freedom of belief, the use of reason rather than strict dogma, and ethical living. Historically, it began as a Christian theology that rejected the Trinity, believing instead in the oneness or the unity of God, and that Jesus was a great moral teacher rather than a God incarnate. But George was a unique character. People described him as giggly, liberal, cultured, charitable, funny, and an impressive scholar. While he was adored by many, he was also considered an outlier in some areas, wearing a collar typically reserved for Catholic priests, even though he was a Unitarian, which this is something that gets brought up by John in the documentary when he finds out from somebody who studies this, and they're like, it is weird that George wears a collar because Unitarians don't believe in the priesthood.
Right.
And George sort of fires back and says, well, anybody can wear a collar. It helps ease people and make them trust you more.
If you look like the classico image of a priest, of a reverend, which is going to be the Catholic one, of course you're going to put on the dog collar. You know, it just makes sense. I think it's part of his funny nature, I think, also to just respond with, anyone can wear it. What do you mean?
Yeah, totally. I think it's just, I think he's doing it for the reason of it does make people feel calmer.
Absolutely.
As opposed to if he came in wearing a t-shirt or something like that. It'd be a little bit different. Presentation does matter. But I think it's also sort of, George is one of those people who wanted to carve his own path.
Right.
And he didn't really care about what anybody else thought. And he wanted to take sort of all the things that he learned over the years and apply it to himself. But in 1977, 4 years after being ordained, George took control of a congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, where he began actively fighting for the LGBT community. And during the 1980s AIDS crisis, he pushed for free condoms to become available at freeway rest stops, among other initiatives to promote safer sex. And after years of witnessing suffering through his ministry, George became drawn to the Right to Die movement, which advocates for legalizing assisted dying across the United States. And people in the movement believe that terminally or chronically ill patients should have the right to die peacefully on their own terms. And this movement aligned with George's belief in complete bodily autonomy and in ending pain for everyone who wanted it. He officially joined the Hemlock Society in 1982, which was a prominent right to die group whose motto was good life, good death. And the group has since joined similar groups and formed Compassion and Choices, which is one of the most well-known right to die advocacy groups in the United States today. He considered this work part of this fluid and expanding spirituality. Throughout his exploration of religions, George came across the City of God Hare Krishna community, which is now called the New Vrindavan, which is located in the Appalachian foothills of West Virginia. And in August 1989, he began his journey there and headed toward the mountains.
Hare Krishna is part of a larger Hindu religious organization, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. George was struck by the interfaith community there and felt he aligned perfectly with their values. Hare Krishna has faced their fair share of cult allegations due to stringent leadership and sometimes quote-unquote brainwashing tactics, but it is still a legitimate branch of Hinduism. George quickly meshed with the community after falling in love with it, and he actually moved there in June 1990, hoping to open a hospice for AIDS patients. By October, his activism blended with his interest in death, leading him and 2 others to found Interfaith Friends, which was the City of God's first affiliate church. While at the City of God, George met Thomas McGurran, who eventually became his romantic partner. Not much is known about Thomas except that he was a Krishna monk for the community when George arrived. For some reason, George began to harbor resentment and accused the group of being quote-unquote totalitarian. It's not clear exactly what happened to make George turn against them, but he and Thomas left the group together and fled to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. While in Pittsburgh, George supported himself financially by caring for a disabled man. He took over a Unitarian congregation and began his own radio show, in which he critiqued local churches. As America's first ever church connoisseur, people began calling him the Church Man. His passion for God, death, and animals prompted him to join Jewish animal activists in pushing Pittsburgh's humane societies to adopt more effective and painless euthanasia methods. George's push for peaceful animal deaths, however, awakened a shocking obsession within him. Soon after uncovering this newfound fixation, he set his sights on encouraging euthanasia for people with physical or mental health issues.
This episode of Lights Out is brought to you by Ro. You've probably seen an ad for a GLP-1 out there. I mean, they're pretty much everywhere these days.
Everywhere, and they all have celebrity endorsements, and I think that leads a lot of people to think that they are out of reach, too expensive.
Yeah, and I mean, that's what we've all been told, right? Well, Ro is really changing the game because they're making GLP-1s actually attainable for the average person. In fact, Ro wants people to lose weight. If you want to lose weight, maybe you've tried all the other methods, or you just want to try a GLP-1, then Ro is the right place to go because they have the lowest cost options out there. And what's really great about Ro is you can actually check your insurance because your insurance might actually cover your medication. And Ro makes that extremely easy with their free insurance checker to see if you're covered. So you just submit your insurance card and then Ro handles the rest.
If your insurance doesn't cover the treatment, they still want you to lose weight. So Ro offers lower cost cash pay FDA approved GLP-1s that include newer dosage like daily pills and multi-dose pens.
Yes, they have all sorts of different options. Pretty much all the brands that you've heard out there, Ro has access to those, and they all are at different price points. So you can truly find something that fits your budget. You work with an actual medical professional who manages your treatment and is there for any questions you have through the Ro app at any time of day. Ro offers a multi-month membership option in addition to multi-month medications that help members prepay and save on their GLP-1 medications. It's just another way Ro is working hard to increase access to this life-changing medication. And the best thing about Ro is that all of this ships right to your door. There's no going into a doctor's office. It's all online. It's all secure. I have a friend who actually uses Ro, and they've said that it was extremely easy to get signed up. Everything shows up right at their door. With the medications from Ro, they've been able to lose a lot of weight that they hadn't otherwise been able to lose in the past. So they've given it a raving review. So join the over 1.5 million people who've trusted Ro to help them with their weight loss journey. So if you're interested, go to ro.co/lightsout to see if you qualify.
That's ro.co/lightsout to get started on Ro.
Go to ro.co/safety for box warning and full safety information about GLP-1 medications. And then in 1995, a man in George's congregation approached him with grave news. He had ALS, also known as Lou Gehrig's disease, and he wanted to die. And, in recent news, as many of us know and saw, the recent tragic and public passing of Eric Dane, famed actor. It's a very debilitating disease that results in a prolonged and painful death. And within a matter of weeks, he assisted the man in dying, supposedly by using a concoction of pills. And it was a life-changing experience for George, and he felt he'd finally found his calling. Watching that first person slowly lose the light behind his eyes was all he needed to commit to a lifetime of death. After the loss of his church member, George established Compassionate Chaplaincy, a right-to-die group that aimed to assist people in their deaths through the presence of a church official. He felt this made the process more spiritually focused and gave people a sense of divine comfort in their final moments. Soon after, he and Thomas moved to Beckley, West Virginia, taking over a new Unitarian congregation. He also helped his foundation become an official nonprofit in the state, eager to take on more clients, hoping to end their lives. The nonprofit's essential purpose was to assist people in dying, a goal that organizations like the Hemlock Society rejected. Until 2001, various right-to-die groups would apparently recommend people to George so he could assist them in their final exit, because they didn't provide the same service as him. During this time, more extreme right-to-die activist groups established sort of the standard way for a self-inflicted death. The person ending their life would first swallow a large amount of sedatives before donning what they called a quote-unquote exit hood, and then lie down awaiting eternal sleep. And it's just as horrifying as it sounds. An exit hood is essentially a plastic bag that the person who is exiting pulls over their head and then velcros tightly around their neck. The apparatus is attached to a helium tank, which delivers lethal amounts of gas into that airtight bag. And death takes only a matter of minutes and is actually painless in almost every case. The person passes out before their heart stops. Sometimes, however, the dying brain starts panicking, and while asleep, the patient will cling to the bag, trying to save themselves as their lungs run out of oxygen. And when this happens, the person accompanying them will physically hold their hands down to let the gas do its job. While this sounds weird, it can be seen as a necessary procedure because a botched attempt can lead to serious cognitive damage, leaving the person potentially even brain dead. George considered himself one of several so-called exit guides who assisted numerous people in taking their own lives, and he quickly rose to infamy in the right-to-die movement. He would take over questionable cases that mainstream organizations had turned down, even though there was a good reason not to. In 2001, the Hemlock Society stopped recommending people to him because of his scandalous methods. A spokesman of the Hemlock Society publicly said that George did, quote, what he thinks is right, but that they have their own standards and policies that are not in sync with his. They asked him to stop using their name in his practice and essentially cut ties with him. Most ethical right-to-die groups refuse to help people who have a chance of recovery and survival. Their options for medical intervention have to be completely exhausted before they can become a candidate for assisted dying, and for good reason. Oregon voters were the first to approve physician-assisted death in 1994, and only under strict conditions. The Death with Dignity Act took 3 more years to be authorized after numerous legal challenges, and while the rest of the country still considered it a crime. Washington was the second state to approve and legalize the act, but that was over 10 years later in 2009, which this meant that activists like George were operating in a murky area of the law when they attended self-inflicted deaths or administered the means to do so. The legality of assisted dying across the United States has been a major subject of debate, but specifically in West Virginia, the public perception has always been negative. As a heavily Christian state, many people strongly oppose this kind of assistance, especially from church officials. The opposition to the practice is so strong that in 2024, West Virginia further codified its opposition, passing a law that explicitly banned assisted dying. So getting back to George, though, the Unitarian Universalist Association also split with him in 2001 because of his right-to-die extremism. And while they had to distance themselves from him, he was allowed to continue serving his congregation in Beckley. George somehow managed to maintain a total of 24 supporters, and his assembly remained enthusiastic about his efforts. They believed he was performing an essential service for people, but maybe that was because they never witnessed what George was actually doing. He was sustained by the congregation through a meager $375 a month, and he also relied on donations from his clients. It's important to note that he claimed he was never in it for the money, but accepted reasonable donations to continue his work.
I think this is a really interesting part of George's whole, I don't know, psyche or whatever you want to call it, but I feel like when we cover most, especially church people, the end result is always they're in it for the money. His extreme views or whatever have led a ton of people to give him money to support him. But that's really, really not the case with George. Like, he's doing this basically pro bono.
Yeah, and I mean, he would, in order to just survive, he was doing other sort of odd jobs
Right.
and eventually sort of tried his hand at real estate and in order to, supplement his income. But yeah, that is one of the things. So you have to kind of look at it and take away sort of the financial motivation behind it. He's not
Right.
getting rich off of doing this. He's not really getting much monetarily, which makes you wonder about what other sort of motives does he have.
Right.
But at this point in time, it seems like, at least on the surface, that George is purely doing this because he truly believes he's offering an essential service that is, in his mind, ultimately helping people transition. But George was adamant that this was his life's work, claiming he'd go as long as he could, as long as God gave him the strength to do it. By 2002, he'd assisted dozens of people in meeting their ends, giving spiritual guidance and also the tools they would need to die. His tools included pill mixtures and what he called magic potions, or bitter liquid poisons that were reminiscent of the harshness of death. He also said that he preferred that exit hood method, believing it offered people the most peaceful, seamless transition to the next life. He and Thomas would travel around together, meeting people at their houses or vacation rentals to discuss and practice the methods of dying. George would never discourage his clients from killing themselves, but would instead jump right into the mechanics of how it all worked. George was genuinely fascinated by the afterlife and called it, as we talked about earlier, a great adventure for his clients. He would even give them a film titled Life After Life, featuring 6 people who detail their near-death experiences. And he thought that by doing this and giving them this tape, that this would be encouraging and provide some relief and calm to sort of the whole process before people entered the unknown.
I think like framing it as George does as a great adventure is, I mean, again, maybe he earnestly believes this, but if we're to believe that a lot of his patients are suffering from some sort of mental health issue, likely hearing it framed as like, this is adventurous. It won't be boring. You're going to have fun, It is the exact opposite of what they're experiencing in their waking life, right? To be like, you're actually going to go do something exciting for the first time ever. Instead of, because I know a lot of other people frame the afterlife as like total peace, total da-da-da, but in George's worldview, it's adventure, it's exciting, it's fantasy.
Yeah, and it's based off NDEs.
Right.
Where people come back and have, in that film, showcases some of the 6 most insane stories of like, entering through a tunnel of light. And
I saw the whole wide world.
Right. And encountering different beings or having sort of this trip.
Right.
And I think that can be incredibly misleading and also sort of manipulative a little bit.
I would definitely say manipulative.
Somebody who's in a very fragile state, and here's somebody coming along and not even giving you all the possibilities, right? Because it's like, yeah, that's one possibility, and to base your entire sort of delivery, your message to these people as it's all good, it's all positive, it's all, sort of love and light. And I think in theory, yeah, that's just a theory, but it could be quite the opposite. You could be setting somebody up for potentially an even worse situation. And I think to not even consider other possibilities is incredibly irresponsible.
And like you said, manipulative. I think, that's what he wants to kind of sell himself as this midwife to dying, right? But I feel like a midwife is a physician at the end of the day, and a physician is going to tell you all the possibilities. They're going to make you fully aware of what's happening.
Right.
He is missing some key parts when he's going to work on his patients.
Yeah, that's a really good point. A midwife in the birth process is going to tell you all possibilities, including worst case scenarios here. And it doesn't seem like George ever did that. It was purely focused on providing exactly sort of the message that he felt like they needed to hear in order to sort of follow through with his process.
Absolutely.
And that to me seems like a major miss on his part. And also perhaps speaks a little bit more to what his real intentions are here. What is the true motive behind this service that he's offering? But let's keep moving forward here. So many times after meeting with a prospective client, George would break down and cry momentarily, claiming he could physically feel their suffering and was empathetic to their pain. And this probably helped him maybe rationalize or process organizing people's early deaths. This supposed compassion was in stark contrast to his technique of covering up his work. He claimed he would set a book in the client's lap and, quote, making it look like they died in their sleep, leaving no trace of his ritualistic euthanasia. It can be difficult to detect helium toxicity in standard autopsies, though forensic teams have been able to spot it more quickly in recent years, but in George's time, it was easy to disguise this manner of death, which is probably how he got away with it for so long. His biggest mistake, however, was traveling to Ireland and assisting a woman in taking her own life, where this kind of practice is completely outlawed.
Rosemary Elizabeth Toole-Gilhooley was a middle-aged Irish woman who was extremely generous and loved to have a good time. Adopted at birth, she was a bright and happy child, but began struggling with mental illness in her teens after her biological mother refused to meet her. By age 49, she was divorced, jobless, and had attempted to kill herself several times, all unsuccessfully. One of her doctors recalled Rosemary asking for help to die, but didn't think that she was hopeless. The truth was she seemed absolutely obsessed with dying. Not long after, Rosemary said that 2 Americans were coming to help her die and asked that her farewell letter be published, a request that the doctor refused. She wanted the publicity too much, and it felt wrong to encourage her feelings about her own demise. The 2 Americans coming to visit were, of course, George and Thomas. In preparation for her death, Rosemary told family and friends that she would be taking her own life, but was careful not to mention her helpers. People later recalled that she seemed really, quote, excited and happy about it, and oddly, that she had the support of those around her. She was supposedly referred to George through a Canadian Right to Die group, and the two had met online. She arranged their flights and accommodations, covering all travel, and provided an additional compensation of $2,500. Though Rosemary was not chronically ill, she had convinced George that she had a brain swelling condition, alongside her depression, that had grown intolerable. That's the only reason he agreed to work with her, but that's according to him. While waiting for George and Thomas to arrive, Rosemary imported an exit hood from Canada through an independent manufacturer. After Rosemary was fully prepared, George and Thomas arrived in Dublin on January 20th, 2002. Supposedly, after picking them up from the airport in a rental car, she took them all around Ireland so Thomas could, quote, get in touch with his roots. They apparently had a wonderful time, hopping from one historic location to another and from one restaurant to another for a few days before heading back to Dublin on the 25th. That night, they went to the Atlantic Coast Hotel in the Irish seaside and had dinner, followed by a visit to the Harbour Master Bar. A band played while the group laughed and talked, slamming one Jack and Coke after another. Once she was completely hammered, Rosemary jumped on a table and began dancing for the bar. Everyone there thought she was wonderful, cheering her on and clapping. They were completely unaware that she was celebrating the last night of her existence. And I don't know, I think it's important to bring up now, like, how common this actually is when people are, they've decided now is the time to take their own life. They often will go from, months and maybe even years of this depressed demeanor to suddenly they're really happy. They do have this, and people often bring that up when they take their own life. They're like, but he seemed so happy right before the end.
Yeah, that's a good point.
After the night of festivities, they headed to a rental that Rosemary had reserved for the night at 33 Donnybrook Manor. She rented the apartment to ensure her 91-year-old father wouldn't find her after she died. When they arrived at the home, George reportedly walked her through 5, quote, practice sessions to prepare her for the final commitment. At one point, George asked her if she was certain she wanted to go through with it. She seemed so cheerful and full of life. She smiled and explained that, while she had enjoyed her final days with Thomas and George, she would be miserable once they left. Leading up to that fateful moment, she'd taken a large concoction of sleeping pills, trying to calm her nerves before closing her eyes forever. Rosemary continued chugging vodka and chain-smoking cigarettes, ruminating on what was coming next. She had the exit hood ready to pull down over her head, filled with enough helium to kill 20 people. George must have grown tired of the whole affair, though, because he suddenly told Rosemary she needed to put the cigarette down, don the hood, and get on with it. After she took her last few drags, he ripped the cigarette out of her mouth. Without hesitation, she pulled the bag over her head, fastened it, and laid down. George and Thomas sat, praying over her, watching the bag suck in and puff out. Although it's a silent, calm death, it has to be somewhat sickening to watch someone die right before your eyes. After she was gone, with the plastic bag still over her head, George pinned 2 notes on her pajamas that said, "Do not resuscitate." They waited half an hour after she was deceased to leave her. In the early hours of the morning, the couple left the rental and headed to Amsterdam, where they planned a vacation. It's pretty bizarre that a couple could go off on a romantic getaway after just watching someone kill themselves. However, George and Thomas had surrounded themselves with death for so long that it probably just felt like another day at the office. The next morning, Rosemary's father reported to the police that he'd found her farewell letter, and then the search began. When they discovered Rosemary and the notes pinned to her, they became suspicious about the manner of death. Within weeks of her death, the Irish police set their sights on the 2 men for, quote, aiding, abetting, procuring, and counseling Rosemary. They officially announced that they sought the extradition of George and Thomas from the United States to be tried in Ireland.
Because assisting someone in self-inflicted death in Ireland can put someone behind bars for up to 14 years. And this became the country's first known case, and it sparked a media storm across Ireland and the United States. Irish radio shows blew up with callers defending Rosemary's right to seek assistance in taking her own life. News channels, on the other hand, painted George as a villain, and perhaps he was. Ireland held an official inquest to have George extradited for trial, which he declined, and they weren't as interested in Thomas since nobody really knew about him, but the Irish police worked closely with the United States to have him returned for trial, but the situation proved tricky. If George had been extradited, he would have been the first person in history to go through that process on account of assisted death charges. Everyone knew he was in hot water and that he would be arrested any day. And this is when famed underground journalist Jon Ronson first heard of him. Jon was famous for interviewing curious characters throughout his career and took investigative journalism to a whole new level. He interviewed the infamous conspiracy theorist and anti-Semite David Icke, who largely popularized the idea that the world is run by a bunch of lizard people. His documentaries were broadcast on a Channel 4 series that was titled Secret Rulers of the World, and his work fascinated audiences. And when Jon got in touch with George, he was enthusiastic about the idea of a documentary and wanted to move quickly, as he was facing imminent arrest. Jon joined the couple on their missions around the country to make a case for ethical assisted self-inflicted death. One day in 2003, George took Jon to Baltimore to visit a prospective client, Pam, as she'd been experiencing chronic fatigue syndrome for decades and was set on killing herself later in the year. Even though George barely made any money, he supposedly provided the tools Pam needed to make her exit. When they arrived, the door slowly creaked open, revealing a gentle, sweet old woman. She welcomed them in to sit on her couch, and George began explaining what he called the mechanics of dying. He walked her through the process, listening to everything she had to say, and for once she felt like someone really understood her, and you could see the relief on her face. Jon said that George never tried to talk her out of it, but actually seemed excited for her to die. She requested that as she faded away, that George and Thomas should perform the Heart Sutra, which is a chant that focuses on the interconnectedness of the world. Months later, Pam succeeded in her exit, but it was apparently a stressful affair for George. In an interview with Jon, he ranted about the failure of their first attempt. On their planned visit to assist her death, they began chanting when Pam suddenly got up and made herself a snack. She casually mentioned that her roommate would be returning from work in a few minutes, but that she would leave the house at 2 p.m. the next day. George and Thomas, panicking, ended up fleeing the home, and it was essential that they were completely alone, as the practice was illegal in Maryland and remains so to this day. George apparently became frustrated with Pam and told her that he wouldn't leave town until he had finished what he came there to do, and she successfully took her life with his company the next day, which this is where things become a lot more concerning.
Right. It's not just him, reaching out from the goodness of his heart to assist these people and coming to the end. Now he's pressuring Pam. I'm not leaving Baltimore until you go through with this finally. And that becomes very wrong.
Well, it's now not becoming about Pam, it's about George.
It's about George. Well, and like the fact that during one of their sessions she's saying, "Oh yeah, I got to go to work at 2 and all this." Like it should be clear to George, as it should be clear to any human who's in this scenario, that she doesn't actually want to do this.
Right.
She's got a plan for the rest of her day. But George is like, "No, this was a complete inconvenience to me, and I'm not leaving until we fix that."
Which I think we can all agree that is inherently a horrible thing.
Horrible.
And I think that really starts making you question his motives in this. Like,
Absolutely.
he's just here to get this done and to witness the act and be on with his day.
Right.
That it's not really about the care for this human being who's making a permanent decision is very unsettling. But Jon continued digging deep into the practice, uncovering more and more disturbing details that made him start to question George's motives and the morality of his practice. One of the most outlandish details George revealed was that in the early days of his career, he would bring a large helium-inflated alligator balloon. It was essentially a prop for a child's party, and it looked absolutely ridiculous. His reasoning was that if he was ever pulled over with helium tanks, he would be suspected of going to help someone to die, as he was becoming well known for it. But somehow this preposterous sort of alligator was supposed to conceal his intentions, which just seems silly
Insane.
and stupid.
Yeah.
And I think it really shows you just where his head's at.
Right.
I mean, that's just crazy. There was no hiding who he was, though, and many groups called for him to be locked up. Because that's the other thing with George, too. And another Unitarian Reverend brought up a really good point about George and sort of his whole practice of, she said something along the lines of, I would have liked to see George have some sort of board or oversight, some type of medical board, somebody with some medical background being a part of this process with him. And the fact that George never did that, and this was a sort of this solo gig for him.
Sometimes Thomas, but
alongside Thomas, but with zero oversight. That was very concerning to her, and I tend to agree with that.
I think it should be concerning to anyone. I mean, the fact that just the basic, the mechanics of dying, as George is calling it, right? He's saying it's painless, but that doesn't mean it's always painless, right? He doesn't really know what's happening to this person as they're dying. And so having a medical person, a real professional, could ensure a smoother process. But to George, it's just another roadblock.
Yeah, I mean, that's what really stuck out to me, too, was even in cases of lethal injection, when it comes to death row inmates, there is a doctor on hand and they're monitoring vitals, and there is some medical oversight in that process. And obviously in a physician-assisted death, there's a doctor there as well.
Right.
But in George's case, there's none of that.
It's just him.
It's very crude.
Yes.
And just honestly just dirty. There's nothing clean or seamless about it.
No.
It's just, according to George, that's what he thinks it is.
Exactly.
But as you said, there's no way to know.
No, there's no one monitoring vitals. And I think, we shouldn't trust the man who brings a gigantic alligator to someone's death. I think that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it is ridiculous. And in 2004, the Irish police formally investigated the extradition process for George, and they asked the FBI to arrest him. They issued a warrant, which the United States Department of Justice passed along to prosecutors, and Thomas, surprisingly, wasn't named in the criminal complaint, even though he had attended numerous deaths, including Rosemary's, which maybe that was because this is sort of a very unique situation.
Right.
And I think prosecutors and the Irish police felt like if they got George, then Thomas is not going to be sort of an issue at that point, that George is sort of just this moral support maybe for George.
Right.
But yeah, they really wanted to get George.
And as we've discussed on like mile higher cases, extradition can be very difficult, especially when, yes, it's strictly outlawed in Ireland. But then in the US, it's this weird gray area that is working out. So I think on top of that, they were like, we want to just go for George because he is the top dog in this. And it would be easier to get the extradition for him as opposed to trying to get the both of them. Like, then it becomes extremely murky.
Yeah. When this happened, George called Jon and asked him to meet up in a Seattle airport hotel. And when he arrived, George informed him that he'd brought a quote-unquote magic potion as he did not intend to travel to Dublin. And he laughed, joyfully claiming that he may be the first right-to-die martyr. Jon was already uncertain what to say, but then George made it even harder when he asked him to film it. Jon immediately refused, as he already had doubts about George's work, and the reason they met in Seattle was that George was attending a private annual gathering of Right to Die leaders, including the Hemlock Society co-founder Derek Humphrey. And Derek essentially began what is now the Right to Die movement when he helped his terminally ill wife unalive herself in a peaceful manner back in 1975. He wrote and published the best-selling memoir, Jean's Way, which chronicled their experience with thoughtfully and intentionally dying. They allowed Jon to come in and film their meeting, which was highly unusual since the movement leaders usually kept things tightly under wraps, according to George. There were a select few Right to Die delegates sitting around a conference table when he made the big announcement that he intended to martyr himself rather than face extradition. George waited with a proud look on his face for the room to erupt in cheers, claps, and applause. Instead, nobody even batted an eye, just staring at him. The first member who said anything asked why he would choose drugs to end his life, which put everyone on the edge of their seats waiting for his answer. It seemed that using drugs as a means to take your own life was frowned upon by the other conference members, as if it made it less honorable. But George explained the issue of people who subconsciously try to remove their hood, which requires another person to be present to ensure that it stays on. And he claimed that he didn't want to put the burden on anyone else to help him physically die, even though he wanted people to witness it. He then boasted about the success of Rosemary's death and how she sent him a message from beyond the grave the day after she died, which is very strange at the very least. But George romantically told the story of how he and Thomas were strolling the streets of Amsterdam one morning when a man walked by carrying a dozen roses on his shoulder. He was filled with pride and wonderment, hoping the conference members would see his divine work at hand. And to George, this guy carrying all these roses was the divine sign, sort of this promise from Rosemary that he had fulfilled, his work with her. And everyone just broke out in hysterical laughter, and George just stared at the wall looking like a sad puppy, and just like this was supposed to be a big profound moment for all of them. Like, wow, George,
you're doing this for us.
Yeah, and people are obviously like, come on.
Right. Don't be ridiculous. And I think this points to something that you said earlier about who's this really for, George? Mm-hmm. It's for him. It's all for him. He's like, I'm going to be the first martyr for our movement. Rosemary sent me a message from beyond the grave. Despite many of the people in this room are also real physicians as opposed to him. And yet in this moment, it's all about George. And when it doesn't live up to what he thinks he deserves, he's disappointed by it.
Mm-hmm. I think the attention he received, he really liked. Absolutely. And almost got off on.
Right.
That he was doing something that was inherently illegal in a lot of places, and he was getting away with it. And I think, like many criminals out there, if you draw any comparisons, they love that sort of attention of sneaking around and operating in this gray area of the law, and in some places completely illegal area of the law. And I think that really did something for him.
100%.
Yeah. If you wanted to truly be a martyr for this cause, it would make more sense to actually get extradited to Ireland and fight legally, fight the legal system that way instead of just dying and running away. If he actually stood his ground and tried to defend his actions, I think he would be seen a lot more in a positive light if he was trying to be a martyr.
Right. No,
but he decided to give up.
Right.
That would be what a real martyr would do.
Right.
Is that they would face whatever was coming their way head on rather than sort of retreat like a coward.
Exactly.
And take the easy way out, so to speak, from, in his mind, like that. I don't. And that's what makes this such a complicated sort of thing, is he's a complicated individual, and it's like, what's going on there? What's going on below the surface? And I think the more that I think Jon's documentary really did a good job of, somebody needed to spend time with him and see him in different situations, in different places, to really sort of start getting the real version of who George was.
Right.
Because I think from the outside, and if you only pop in and see a few minutes of George, you're like, oh, he's sort of
charming guy.
Yeah, he seems like he's got good intentions. It seems like he really cares about people and is really trying to offer this essential service. But I think the more you spend time with him and you hear him divulge sort of the inner thoughts that he has around this, the more it seems to come from a very selfish place.
Absolutely. So at this point, Jon and George had actually known each other for years. And one day, he developed a disgusting idea, looking to taunt Jon about the taboo of his work. He wanted a reaction out of him, a way to creep him out, and he succeeded. One morning in the spring of 2007, Jon received a tape from George, and when he played it, the background of an office came into picture as a disheveled-looking George stepped out from behind the camera and sat in his desk chair. His intention was to show Jon the process of walking someone through their death. He claimed he was calling his friend Shirley to assist her while she stayed at a hotel in Arizona. She had the same bottle of poison that George had for himself, which he deemed the Rolls-Royce of self-inflicted death methods.
Which is a weird thing to say.
I know, it's very weird.
Which I'm not even sure if we'll be able to play this tape on YouTube for obvious reasons. But if you want to hear it, if it doesn't end up making it into the YouTube episode, definitely go listen to it on the audio version on Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
So in case we can't show the clip on YouTube, this is what it shows. This is what George's tape to Jon pictures. So when Shirley answered the phone, George exchanged greetings before saying, "The hour has come that we've been planning." He was calm, methodical, but almost domineering. George seemed to comfort her at first and said he was honored to share this moment. He then asked her to raise her glass, literally and symbolically. It seemed that Shirley had started drinking, but stopped, leading George to become visibly frustrated. He ordered her to just keep going and put her finger over her nose if she had to. It sounded like he was talking to a child who disobeyed them, frustration clearly igniting behind his sunken eyes. Moments later, he began a Buddhist chant, "Gate, gate, paragate," which translates to "gone, gone, gone beyond." It's the first half of the closing phrase of the Heart Sutra, which seemed to be part of his routine. A few minutes later, he asked if Shirley could hear him, but there was no answer. He then looked directly at the camera, said he heard the phone drop, and that she was probably gone. "And that's it," he said. "That's the way it's done." He got up and turned off the camera, as if he'd just finished a regular old job. Jon later asked him why he got so frustrated with his clients when they weren't following instructions, given that it was probably a really hard time for them. George became upset again and vented about how much he hates the back and forth with clients, which that's the whole...
Super concerning.
Yeah, that's super concerning. That's the point of a midwife. That's a conversation, you know?
Well, if you've ever had an experience with a midwife, they would never, ever, ever pressure you or push you in any direction whatsoever. They would merely inform you if something was happening or something needed to be addressed. They would inform you, but they would never push you in one direction or another.
They never say, do this, do that.
It would always be up to your discretion on what your next move would be. And in this case, George is very clearly pushing you in one direction and one direction only.
Right. But George explained to Jon that he believed if a client was serious about it, they needed to just drink and stop whining. Apparently, flying to different places week after week was too inconvenient for him, and he needed clients to quickly make a decision if they were going to die or not. What started as a compassionate option for people taking their lives became a busy, hectic schedule for George. When Jon showed the videotape to a forensic psychologist, he suggested that George got some kind of sexual gratification from assisting people's deaths. When he hung up the phone on the video, the psychologist claimed, quote, that was his orgasm. And it made sense. As you can see in it, his body almost relaxes into itself after many tense minutes of waiting for Shirley's heart to stop. Around that time, George had adopted a new assistant to take over Thomas's position after he became sick with chronic fatigue syndrome. Her real identity has been concealed, but Jon refers to her as Susan. She first met George when she asked for his help to die after a brown recluse spider bite, claiming that the pain was unbearable. She said the only reason she didn't go through with it was that she couldn't leave her pet snake behind. Jon found this reaction excessive, since these bites typically heal on their own. As he spent more time with Susan, though, he began to understand the real underlying issues. Susan complained that George would often have sudden outbursts, screaming and storming out of the room when they talked. They constantly bickered, especially over the financial aspects. The most revolting thing about Susan was that she and George fundamentally disagreed about money and how that related to their practice. Susan disclosed to Jon that she had every intention of taking over when George died, and she would begin charging people for her services. She said she saw it as a business, whereas George saw it as a calling, explaining that for her, no cash equaled no help. Not only did she want to take over for George, but she was already starting her own small death business on the side behind his back. According to her, she was willing to help anyone, even people who weren't sick, if the price was right. Her average quote was estimated to be $7,000. When Jon pushed back on this, saying she could mess it up one day and help the wrong person, she just shrugged her shoulders. Susan agreed that probably, at some point, she would take the life of someone she shouldn't, but that was the cost of doing business. This carelessness underlined the hidden evils that can give the Right to Die movement a bad name. Jon mentioned the possibility of George taking his own life soon if the FBI shows up at his door. Susan responded by saying she knew that, and that's why she'd been pressuring him to give her a list of his clients so she could take over his cases, hoping to rake in some extra cash. I mean, I would say Susan's basically a hitman.
Yes.
You know, there's not much. It's the people deciding who dies for cash, but that's the only difference here.
No, I think it also says a lot that George even began working or associating himself with someone like Susan,
right,
who's so very clearly just a killer.
Yeah, she just kills people. So the three of them, George, Jon, and Susan, went out for lunch one day to talk more about the ins and outs of death as a profession. Susan claimed to have all sorts of sensitivities and ailments triggered by this spider bite, saying she could only eat at one specific restaurant for her safety. Everyone was totally willing to go there, but she suddenly changed her mind and suggested that they go to a buffet, which is a literal nightmare for anyone with true food allergies. That's when Jon started to realize that Susan was just a straight-up hypochondriac and a chronic liar. He asked George how he could let someone like Susan take their own lives when they weren't truly sick. George just put up his hands as if to say, I don't know. So Jon asked if he would still assist Susan in dying, to which he just said, sure. The possibility began to sink in that maybe George didn't care about helping people as much as he loved watching them die.
Which I'm really glad that Jon did this documentary.
Me too.
Because without it, I don't know that we would have the perspective on George that we do now.
Right.
Maybe to some extent, but to see it firsthand from George in person, I think, was extremely powerful to watch.
Absolutely.
And also chilling to watch at the same time.
Yes.
Because toward the end of filming the documentary, Jon received a call from Susan on June 25th, 2007, and the FBI had finally arrested George. That morning, Thomas woke up to George and two men standing over him who explained he was being arrested and sent to Ireland. The magic potion that he was supposed to chug before being arrested still sat in the fridge, unopened. George was not going to fulfill his heroic martyrdom fantasy, as he had promised at the conference after all. A few weeks after he was arrested, Susan took ownership of the business and she flew to New Zealand to help a depressed, non-terminally ill woman complete her quote-unquote exit. The client had apparently reached out to a Right to Die group in New Zealand, which wasn't willing to help her. And that's when she found Susan online and asked her to fly out and help. After hearing this, Jon got in touch with Leslie Martin, who co-founded Exit New Zealand, a Right to Die group, and she explained that it seemed this client needed more help with living than dying, and that she had a good chance at a normal life. The euthanasia underground was an absolute mess, according to Leslie, and she believed people seeking to end their lives could fall victim to gung-ho right-to-die activists who want to help people die for their own satisfaction, like Susan. And when Jon asked Susan why she helped the New Zealand woman, she explained that the client had a breathing disorder that doctors wouldn't prescribe medication for. And Susan claimed to have the same condition and gave the client some of her medication to help, but still went on to carry out the assisted death even after the woman was feeling better and breathing normally, which... Murder.
I mean, you solved the issue that was supposedly ailing her so much she wanted to pass away. But you're just like, all right, no, we're still going through with it. You called me, so here I am.
Yeah. And Jon felt the same way. Jon told her she shouldn't have done it. But Susan just said, somebody's got to pay the bills. Which, how disgusting.
Yeah.
And I mean, God, she clearly needs to be investigated. But Jon clarified in the documentary that he agreed to keep her identity private before he found out that she was making a business out of people's unnecessary deaths. Jon couldn't communicate much with George after he was arrested, and he seemed to lose interest in it anyway. Maybe George needed to stay locked up, preventing him from encouraging more people to die. According to him, he was tormented in jail, constantly being belittled, harassed, and threatened. Most of this stemmed from his sexual orientation, he believed, since other inmates would call him the F slur. His sexuality was a consistent topic that the media used as leverage to bash him, according to his spokesman. On one occasion, someone threw a book at him, which hit him right in the eye. Fed up with the treatment from everyone around him, he threatened to starve himself, holding on to the grand idea of martyring himself. Although he had been arrested for the death of Rosemary, the United States refused to extradite him and decided to try him in his home country. And after a few months of being in jail, the case went to trial.
During the hearings, George was insistent that he had no clue that assisted death was illegal in Ireland. He claimed to conform his actions to American law, where it's not illegal to sit with people while they take their own lives, as long as they procured and administered their own means of death. In Rosemary's case, this is exactly what happened, and even the American Bar Association agreed with this point. There were many mixed opinions brought up during the trial. Several people and organizations came forward to voice their views, either for or against George. Rosemary's own father, Owen, supposedly felt like he had to give George his blessing. Rosemary's death was the, quote, end of a long, sad story, according to him. Her doctor also testified that she'd spoken about taking her own life for years and made extensive and meticulous preparations in relation to killing herself. The doctor also claimed there was no evidence that she was influenced, forced, or assisted in her death, which I don't really know how you could prove that.
Yeah.
You know, we don't know what happened at the end.
Yeah. I mean, it just seems like this was a first-time experience for all parties involved in this trial, and they didn't really know, like, how do you go about trying this and proving the intent from George's behalf, and when there's what evidence is ultimately what it comes down to when you talk about a trial. So I think it made it very difficult.
Absolutely. A representative of Not Dead Yet, which is an anti-right-to-die group, called for George's extradition for, quote, exploiting the desperation of others. The organization is a national disability rights group that opposes assisted self-inflicted death, sometimes called, quote, mercy killings, because they can put pressure on disabled people to take their own lives. In their view, helping someone with a physical or mental disability in dying can quickly turn into a slippery slope towards eugenics or ableism. The Irish police, known as the Gardaí, sent 2 officers to attend the trial. They claimed to have probed the emails sent between Rosemary and George, and that forensic officers swept the flat for fingerprints. This evidence didn't amount to much in convicting George, though. The pathologist who carried out the autopsy said that Rosemary surely died of asphyxia as a result of inhaling helium and enduring suffocation. The level of sedatives in her system was also a contributing factor, clearly labeling this a self-inflicted death and not a homicide. In the morning of George's final hearing on October 26, 2007, he walked into the courtroom smiling and hopeful. he gave a brief thumbs up to the dozens that were awaiting the report. Judge R. Clark Van de Voort announced that they would not send him to Ireland, officially denying the extradition. He became a free man after 4 months in jail at the age of 65. George broke out in tears at the news, and the courtroom became filled with the sounds of gasps, cheering, and crying in support of him. One of his followers dramatically slumped against the wall, sliding down as her shoulders heaved with sobs. George's spokesman, Richard Cote, predicted that the ruling would prove key in the fight to recognize self-inflicted death as an inherent human right. Judge Van de Voort reasoned that while George's conduct could be considered wrong, quote, it was generally not recognized as criminal in the United States, and that extradition couldn't be justified. As of 2026, assisted death, now called medical aid in dying or death with dignity, is legally authorized in 13 states and Washington, D.C. The caveat is that physicians cannot actively euthanize patients. They can only provide assistance for patients administering their own means of dying. Not Dead Yet was very unhappy with Van de Voort's decision and publicly lashed out against the judge and the court for freeing George. They later posted on their website, "Where George goes, death or serious weirdness follows, sometimes both, and it's not a good kind of weirdness." While they were happy about his arrest at first, their disdain for him only deepened after he was released, probably feeling that the system had failed them. But after his release, George stepped into the street, grateful and surprised by the court's decision. Smiling, he offered up his jail lunch, which was just a bologna sandwich and some cookies, to those nearby, and then he announced that he would preach at his parish in Lewisburg, West Virginia, that Sunday.
After George was released, John filmed what is believed to have been their final conversation. And during that interview, George revealed something very sinister to John. If you remember back to that tape, that phone call that he supposedly had with Shirley, well, it turns out that that was all an act. He said it wasn't the real thing, and that only a dial tone was ringing in his ear as he delivered the fabricated instructions. He said it was just a way to show an example of the process. And it's also possible that maybe he's just trying to show off as if it were some type of exhibition or something. He said he'd been working with her, but she wasn't ready to commit. And her name wasn't even Shirley. It was Karen Stern, a young, gorgeous guitar player, but she felt the weight of the world was too much pressure. And she ended up taking her own life without George's help 3 days after he was released from jail. John couldn't help but notice he seemed almost amused by that, happy to share that he was just playing a sick joke about a deceased woman. After that, John ended the interviews with George, his head a total mess after dealing with the roller coaster. John wrote that he was stupid for faking the tape as it made him seem disingenuous. Joking about someone taking their lives when that's supposed to be your calling is pretty sickening. And it's almost more disturbing that this was faked than it being the real thing. I'd already be concerned if this was how he conducted his ministry for all the people he was involved with. But the fact that he did this disingenuously and then, this is how he reacted to it and just sort of plays it off as this bizarre joke,
right,
is super concerning and makes you question everything about him.
Absolutely. I mean, I know he said that the reason he faked it was just to show John an example of the process. But of course, if that were true, he would have told John, this is a fake, this is a recreation. I'm not really doing this here.
Why lie about
why
that?
Why lie? Why do you think? Why do you think he faked it?
I think he is so deep in this at this point that he's so disillusioned with this whole practice of his. And maybe at the beginning he was different, but I think the more he's done this, the further removed he's actually become from the true reasons for doing it in the first place. Right. And he has started to realize there is some satisfaction that he's getting, and whether that be sexual or some other sort of sick satisfaction he's gaining from it, that even just the act of playing it out in a fake scenario gives him some pleasure. And I don't think he even realizes that that's the way that it comes across, and that I think he's just deep in it.
I think so too. And I think like part of it is this obsession, this exhibition of himself to people to kind of, I don't know, maybe sell how strange he is, or how, I'm willing to do this when no one else is, because Jon is not willing to, he's not actually shooting footage of him killing these people or assisting them in dying. And so I think George does get a satisfaction out of like, well, I can fool him. I can fool him with this one. I can send it to him. He doesn't want to see it happen, but he's going to think he saw it happen. And so I do think there's a satisfaction, like you were saying earlier, in skirting the rules. Even with this journalist who's trying to be ethical in his documentary by sending him this fake tape.
100% that he's almost playing this dual character at this point.
Right.
In one light, he's comes across as this, doer of good. But then in this other light, in which we saw in this tape that he filmed, that there is this whole other side to him. And I think it was almost enjoyable for him to tease Jon with this.
Definitely.
And give him sort of a glimpse inside what it's like. And he's like, if it came across Rush, then, it's just because, but we know from his own, his own words and what people have observed of George in these situations, that no, this is very accurate to what he actually does with his quote unquote clients.
In his own words, he kind of wants to rush it. He's tired of the back and forth.
Exactly. And I think that is deeply, deeply disturbing. And I think it completely rewrites any sort of opinion one could have on George when you see this. It definitely was a very eye-opening way to end this documentary and sort of find out of like, you faked this? Like, and that forensic psychologist, I think, summed it up perfectly, that it doesn't matter. That just George saying those things and doing the chant and going through sort of his ritual.
Right.
And I think that's what he really created, is he created a ritualistic method for terminating people's lives.
Right.
And is there any actual care or love or support coming from George at all? Or is this purely about George at the end of the day?
Right.
And what he feels when people do this? I mean, it's insane. But the documentary Reverend Death, which is on YouTube if you want to watch it, which I would say if you want to see more of George and also hear from Jon himself, I would say absolutely take the time to watch it. I think Jon did a very good job.
Fantastic
with this.
job.
I mean, considering the subject and the individuals involved, I think it was very eye-opening. But it was released on May 19, 2008. And after its release, Jon said working with George wasn't enjoyable at all. He recalled that the things he liked most about George when he met him, his libertarian and maverick qualities, were actually the things most worrying about him in the end. By the time the film was released in 2008, George claimed to have assisted in at least 102 self-inflicted deaths, with 82 of those being George was there in person and 20 of those being sort of this remote capability, which you saw him act out in his tape. He believed that he had never done anything so important during his ministry throughout his life. He proudly described himself to a reporter as a midwife to the dying, for those who want to hasten their deaths. Later in 2009, the coroner for the case officially said there was no proof that Rosemary had been actively assisted in taking her own life, which relieved George of any further accusations. By late 2010, George began seriously trying to turn a home he bought in Gastonia into a hospice. And that's when locals and neighbors finally began catching on and went public with either shame or support. And many neighbors, I mean, rightfully so, began complaining about the fact that George has bought this house, is going to turn it into whatever his hospice would end up being. And there's, their kids are being dropped off from school and they're going to be walking nearby. And rightfully so, they're concerned about George and who he really is. I would be too.
Definitely.
I wouldn't want him moving into my neighborhood and starting up this practice of his. County officials told reporters that the hospice facility wouldn't be allowed to use weapons or narcotics to assist in people's exits. They were trying to flesh out the legality of this kind of operation in a residential neighborhood, hoping to fight it. And if the proposed facility had come to fruition, it would have been the first of its kind in the country. George was adamant that people would supply their own means of death and that he planned to open it by December 2010. He later released a TV ad promoting the service, clarifying that only terminally or chronically ill clients would be accepted, because obviously he's now trying to do it legally, it sounds like. Literally made it onto the news. And he was interviewed, it sounds like, on the phone on WBTV, and he said, "This kind of ministry or assistance is available only to people who are very certain that they want it and need it, and their circumstances in life are painful or the end of their life is imminent." Reverend George Exoo. As for Jon, he released his book Lost at Sea on October 30th, 2012, and in it he discusses not only his encounters with George, but also with plenty of other prominent outlandish figures. Jon claims that before he met George, he was very pro-right to die, but changed his outlook after being exposed to the assisted death underground scene. It wasn't until he witnessed all the elements of it and saw how someone like George and Susan can take advantage of the system that really changed his mind on the matter. It's believed that George continued to quietly assist clients in taking their own lives until he passed away on May 26, 2015 at a hospice in Beckley, West Virginia at 72 years old. He was preceded in death by his partner Thomas and survived by their beloved cat Shiva. But George left behind a very, very controversial and complicated legacy. Like we said, in the end, he was responsible for taking part in at least 102 assisted deaths. And for some, he was sort of an angel of death, innocently and generously sticking by people in their final moments. Many believed it was a rare gift to have a spiritual leader sit beside you as the light faded. But others believed that he was in it for all the wrong reasons. Many people agreed with the sexual gratification theory, or that he got a rise out of doing something taboo and illegal. His exact motives, though, will never be understood, and his story leaves people still wondering if he was in fact a true activist or a criminal, possibly even a killer of sorts. And his story sort of brings to light a balancing act between good and evil. And on one hand, he was a smiley, witty, friendly old man who seemed sincerely eager at times to help people. He was dearly beloved by those close to him, both inside and outside of his congregation. But on the other hand, he watched eagerly as his clients prepared for their deaths, sometimes impatiently forcing them to just get on with it during the single most important decision of their lives. And that moment when their chest stops expanding, their limbs go limp, and the energy leaves their body was something of an addiction for George at the end of the day. The first case involving the man with ALS gave him a high he couldn't stop chasing until the very end. And I do believe that is part of it for George.
I agree.
I think it wasn't just, I think he was obsessed with death, and he was obsessed in experiencing that with people and watching them die. So was this a legitimate calling for George at the end of the day? Was it really rooted in good intentions, love, and care? Or was there something more disturbing happening within? And I think that's, we will never truly know one way or another. But I think if you look at everything as a whole, and I take Jon's experiences to heart, and I think if anybody really saw what was going on within, it was Jon. And I think his sort of disdain for George by the end of things really said a lot to me.
Right.
Because he spent a lot of time
Years
with him and years with him, and it really became clear, and especially the tape. I mean, the tape was a big sign, and hearing a forensic psychologist be like, no, he's clearly getting something out of this, really swayed me in one direction. I think this is one of those perhaps stories where maybe, just maybe, it started in a good place with good intentions.
Right.
And inherently, George was trying to further his ministry and help comfort people and be there for people in those final moments. But I think as time went on and the more he saw and assisted, it did something else for him.
Yes.
Or it awakened something else within him that maybe he didn't know even existed. And there was something more he was getting out of this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, if in his career, it goes back to really wanting to assist the AIDS patients initially with hospice care. And right, that, like you said, I think that's the part where it starts as something good, especially during that time. They were given basically no resources if you had AIDS. And here's this one guy who's willing, as a spiritual leader, to offer you some guidance and closure at the end. I think that's where he began with his good intentions. And that's why it's all the more disconcerting and slimy to see where it ends, right? Like, these people are not terminally ill, they're just not.
Right.
And I think if you had a real psychologist, physician, anyone, they'd recognize that even the people who are saying like, oh, all these other clinics are telling me that nothing's wrong with me, that psychologist or physician would be able to tell them like, that's because you're depressed. That's because you're dealing with a mental health issue. And there still is treatment for that, but it's just not the kind that you're looking for, especially in this era. I think people of an older generation now don't want to admit when they're depressed or dealing with a mental health issue. So they immediately are like, no, it's a disease that no one can find. But again, that's not what's happening here. It's George is pretending to be, and maybe he believes it himself, this welcoming force to the other side instead of what he actually is, which is a killer,
Yeah, and it seems like when it comes down to it, he got into this for a completely bizarre reason, and that bizarre reason being his own personal fascination with death and the afterlife, and his obsession with the life after life film, and specifically those who experience NDEs.
Right.
And to seemingly base your whole philosophy off of people's NDEs and then use that as a mechanism to convince one
to sell death,
to sell or persuade one to follow through with something so permanent seems like a major misstep on his part.
Absolutely.
And I think that's why there needs to be serious conversation around this whole right to die activism and the laws I think there really needs to be serious conversations and oversight, really. I'm one to believe in bodily autonomy, and one should have the right over their body to do as they please, and I think it's in another sort of sense, a lot of as you said, a lot of these people, had they had contact with somebody other than George with a medical background or or a mental health background, maybe would have made a different decision.
Right.
And George only had one sort of path. There wasn't really no other option, even though he would say, are you sure you want? But
sure?
It's like, he could have done, if he truly wanted to help these people, I guess what I'm trying to say, he would have built out a team. He would have found other people that could provide other sort of paths or professional guides, I guess, added other guides to sort of this service of his. But I think it ultimately came down to what he wanted and what he got out of it, because it was George
all the way down,
every single time.
Yeah. Well, and one of the leaders of the Hemlock Society, he said in a quote to John, I don't think it was in the documentary, I think it was just in an article John wrote about it, but he was talking about, he didn't believe that George got sexual gratification out of it. He believed truly that George was just overly excited about the afterlife because of these NDEs.
Yeah.
And was completely convinced that it's going to be better than what you're doing here. And so I think that put horse blinders on George to other possibilities for support for his patients. It was just like, oh, it doesn't matter if you're going to talk to anyone to make it better, because the afterlife is so much fucking better than anything here.
Which, that's a slippery slope.
Very slippery slope.
And yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, that's one idea. There's an infinite other possibilities here. We have no idea. We're going off of something that is not even understood by science and could be a hallucination for all we know. I
Right.
mean, we have no clue. And to make that sort of absolute fact in regards to the service he provides is, I mean, that's your venture, and even if it's not coming from this ill intent, it's still inherently wrong.
Right. And manipulative.
Yeah.
Right.
What about you, Daniel? You have any final thoughts?
I'm kind of in agreement with you, Josh. I think that his intention in the beginning was good-hearted, but like many things, it kind of fell apart and I don't want to say turned evil, but turned wrong towards the end. I think maybe his obsession with death almost turned into a numbness after doing it so many times. And he stopped caring about the person. He only cared about the result. And he wanted to see what each person's reaction was with their life ending. I do have a question though. Something needs to be done about Susan. If she's still out and about, and something needs to be done.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I don't think there's any further reportage on her. Really, she's a hitman.
That scares me, genuinely.
Yeah, because she's definitely criminal.
Yeah.
I mean, and my guess is when this documentary aired, which I mean, it's been, almost 20 years since this aired. I would hope that somebody saw it and attempted to go figure out who this woman was and did something, or maybe even Susan, because of the documentary and sort of the fallout from it, maybe stopped what she was doing, or who knows. But
I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, also, you can kind of tell she's somewhat unstable. So I think that added publicity probably was like, okay, I'm gone. I'm out.
Yeah, which hopefully that's the case.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, what do you guys think about the Right to Die movement, and how has this story changed your opinions on it, if it has?
I would say, the Right to Die movement, because it's almost like a given. You have the right to die. That's not the issue here. I think the issue really comes down to being afforded the resources and support to either offer other alternatives or make it as peaceful as possible if all other alternatives are exhausted, right? Because you do have the right to do it yourself, and I think that's wrong personally, but you do. It's always afforded to you. That's not the question. The question is, how else can you be helped? And I think once all other avenues have been exhausted, as George did not do, then it's something to look into and be supported through.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of different lens to look at this sort of through, and it depending on sort of the lens you look at this through, and I think for one, like all of us have been personally affected by, we've all known somebody who's taken their own life, and we all know the implications of that and the aftermath of that and the difficulty in processing that. And so I think when you look at it through sort of that lens, and you look at the person and at what point in their life were they at when they did it, and I think the circumstances really change sort of the perspective of maybe how you feel about that. But I think if you look at it from a sense of somebody with a terminally ill diagnosis, or somebody who, like, if you have a grandparent who, I've had many grandparents who've been like, I'm just going to take my own life at some point when I can't do what I want to do anymore, And so when you think about that, and you think of how that's going to, if they follow through with that and they do it in a way that is traumatizing to the rest of your family, I mean, that can be way worse. So if there is legal assisted deaths with the help of a professional medical team, and you can do it in a setting that isn't so traumatic and so, it doesn't have the same effect as it does, if you go to Grandpa's house and you find Grandpa and it's clear that he took his own life. I mean, you do it in a medical setting, and there's a peaceful transition to it, and everybody can kind of sort of get on the same page, but ultimately Grandpa's making his own decision, and Grandpa was done and he wants to go. And I am on board with that. And I think that is a right that we all should have. And I think the government should respect that, and respect that if you get to a point and you have exhausted all avenues, and that for you as a personal choice, having full autonomy over your body, you've made that decision with the, support of loved ones and everybody else in your life, then I don't see why that should be an issue. And I think it needs to be done in a way that feels humane and feels like it's morally ethical. And because again, like with this particular story and with George, there is the underground scene that exists.
Right.
And so there are going to be people that either seek out the underground scene or just go and do it on their own anyway.
Right.
And so I think if you give people an option to do it in a way that minimizes the sort of the aftermath for their loved ones and their family, and it can be a more, as peaceful and a sort of a healing process as possible, I don't see the issue with that whatsoever.
Right.
It's, there's 13 states and I think it should be all 50 states. I think that should be an option for any American and anybody, and, as a human being.
Because the alternative can be much worse.
And I think from my own personal experience, I know that it is. It is. It's absolutely worse. And so I think there is a lot of good that can come from the Right to Die movement, and for, the government to get on board with laying out a very well thought out, well researched, scientifically, driven solution to that issue. And I think it could ultimately help a lot of people and their loved ones and their families in this process that's already inherently difficult.
Right.
So it's I get it though. It's very convoluted. There's it's one of those issues that has theology interwoven into it. And I think that's one of the biggest issues, as we talked about with West Virginia. You talk about a more conservative state that, has a largely faith-based sort of system to it, and politicians in place there that a lot of people of a religious background wholeheartedly disagree with the whole idea of unaliving yourself. And so I think it's one of those that's going to be a tug and pull probably forever, because just everybody's going to have a different opinion on it. It was interesting in the documentary that John was talking to a theologian, and he asked him, like, is unaliving brought up in the Bible? Is there a mention of it? And there's not. And the only thing he could come back to was the 10 Commandments.
Thou shalt not kill.
And then was like, yeah, well, that doesn't explicitly say, it implies other people and not yourself. And that was literally the only thing that he sort of pointed to that was within Scripture. And so it's one of those things that is up to interpretation to everybody, and everybody's going to have a different outlook. And I think that's what makes it so difficult for legislators to get on the same board with, because it's very split down the middle.
Right.
But I think as society evolves and changes, and if you look at just sort of the future, and one of the things that I was actually very happy about that was recently passed was new legislation around psychedelic medications and the implications that they have on mental health and psilocybin and things like that. And so I think we're moving in a progressive direction that is ultimately going to, I think psychedelic medication can be, especially applied in a medical setting, can be extremely helpful to the mental health epidemic that we have, and to all humans, being a personal user of psychedelics. I feel like it could have major implications for the future of society, our civilization, and humans in general. And so I think we're moving in that direction where the government is we're starting to sort of unravel the grips that it's had over us since, the Reagan years and the Nixon years, and sort of the war on drugs and this war on bodily autonomy. And I think eventually, I think it's gonna be a long time. I'd like to think in our lifetimes,
Agreed,
we may get to a point where this is physician assisted you know, is legal in all 50 states. I think we're going to get there in our lifetime.
And I think without it, without that legislation, we get George.
Exactly.
This is what happens when you don't have that.
When you enable people to take advantage, find the loopholes, and potentially you are creating killers or creating opportunities for people to become killers or serial killers. And that's terrifying. Yeah. And so, yeah, it'll be really interesting to kind of see where this continues to go. But yeah, obviously let us know your thoughts. I know there's a lot discussed, very, very heavy episode. And, of course, I just want to, before we end this, put it out there to anybody who may be struggling or know somebody that's struggling with thoughts of self-harm or you're not alone, and help is available right now. In the United States, you can call or text 988 for the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, or text HOME to 741741 to reach Crisis Text Line for free, confidential 24/7 support. In Canada, you can call or text 988 for the National Suicide Crisis Helpline. If someone is in immediate danger, you call 911. In the UK, if there is immediate risk to life, you can call 999, or you can call Samaritans 24/7 by calling 116123 for confidential emotional support. Reaching out is a strong and courageous step, and there are people ready to listen and help you stay safe, one moment at a time. But thank you for being here with us today. Appreciate it. And we'll see you guys next time. Lights out, everybody.